much. So I'm really encouraged by the contributions of the other panelists today. So much of what I say is really underlining some of the previous contributions. As a philosopher, it's been really exciting to engage with this group, looking at how abstract values can be applied in practical contexts in various areas, because an abstract value is not a value unless it can be realized in practice. And as others have said, context is the key to this. And the context in this particular area is not only extremely complex, it needs to include consideration of how ethical considerations in one area might have an impact on other areas, even areas perhaps quite distant. Hence, we need to examine, as panelists before have said, governance across sectors, and also critically examining infrastructures, as panelists before me have pointed out how much the infrastructure we're talking about underlines so much of what we do and what we need access to in society. So hence all of this is going to need and is involving ongoing work with really wide participation from society and critically from different disciplinary perspectives. And one thing I want to stress is that the continual nature of this work should not be seen as a reflection of failure, but it's actually a key feature of its ethical nature, since ethical engagement inherently involves dialogue, accountability, and self-reflection across society. So just as it was pointed out, Joe Pearson pointed out that notions of transparency and accountability were most highlighted in this report as being critical in this sector. Likewise, it's actually accountability and self-reflection and transparency in how we're considering the ethical issues, which is itself, I think, absolutely critical to it actually being an ethical engagement. And this also needs to include keeping a close track of how we have perhaps changing attitudes to values as our technology develops and as it shapes our lives. Because we're talking about something which is really engaged critically in the infrastructure of how we think and engage in the world. So as Philip Napoli and others have pointed out, tensions between our different abstract values is one key. And we need to bear in mind all values as we examine each individual value. But there's a two-way process from abstract principle to application, but also back again. For as we examine such tensions, and as we examine the difficulties of applying abstract concepts in particular areas, we're going to be increasing our understanding of those very core values and principles, which we then must be prepared to update and maybe amend. So examining concrete use, this is why it's been so exciting to be on this in this working party. Examining concrete use can help to illuminate our more abstract values and to see how they're developing and how they might need to be amended. And particularly in this area, because these technologies play such a large part in how we relate to each other, how we communicate, how we gain knowledge of the world, and that in that process, they're very likely to impact upon how we think of value. So previous panelists have outlined many of these issues in a lot of concrete detail. So we're also going to discover, in looking at the context, some limits and constraints on the application of some of our key values. So, for example, Cornelia Cutterer has talked about the very real difficulties of operationalizing recommendations in practice. And I think it's absolutely critically important that we acknowledge this and do not attempt to ignore the reality of these difficulties, not least because of a possibility that this could lead by example to acceptance of perhaps suboptimal ethical solutions in other areas. And we really must understand how the challenges and limits of application in different areas might mean that an abstract value concept is actually being used rather differently in different concepts. So we may have an appearance of agreement in principle, but that's actually, if we look at the context of application, more and more illusory. So a broad idea may refer to the same abstract value in theory, but in practice might come apart in different areas. So for instance, as this court report has highlighted, and as many of the previous contributors have emphasized, there's rightly really serious concern about consent in the area of media and technology, highlighted by this report and by others. But especially as, for example, the infrastructure and uses become such an integral part of life, and as we're nudged to certain views and persuasions, actually achieving something which could sincerely be called consent becomes very, very complex and difficult. So this underlines the concerns of some previous panelists, such as the points raised by Natalie Hellberger, highlighting agency and powers. And this, as I think we're all here aware, needs to be the subject of ongoing research and monitoring, because despite best efforts, there could be questions about whether in all contexts, given the realities of how we need to engage with best technologies, we may end up in some contexts with what looks like consent in name only. Certainly, it may look rather different to notions of consent in other areas, such as in medicine or in sexual consent, where when we're talking about what counts as a standard of, say, consent to sexual relations, could end up looking very, very different to the kinds of things that cash out as consent in this particular area. So we mustn't let a change in the reality of what consent means become an effective fiction. We must acknowledge this head on, not just for this area, but because of a danger that it might then weaken notions of consent in other areas. So, for example, Elizabeth Crossick noted how in the UK there's been very, very low uptake for the track and trace app for coronavirus because of issues with trust. And there are also concerns now, whether justified or not, the concerns exist, that data and apps might be used currently, for example, to require proof of immunity in order to enter what you might think of as being the normal activities of civil society. So there's been, whether or not these concerns are justified, there are concerns about whether or not we might be traced in order to enter cinemas or sports arenas or to travel and so on. So among the multiple important questions to be asked here, this raises questions about whether there might be, for example, in another area, a policy of consent to, say, vaccination, but that might not in any meaningful sense be consent with all the implications for trust, amongst other issues that it implies, if it's needed to gain access to what might be seen to be the normal structures of society. And likewise in this area, as the infrastructures of AI underlying how we react and relate to the world is becoming more and more ubiquitous, we've got to take real care that weakening of meaningful consent in one area doesn't occur, and that any differences in the precise meaning of consent in application in one area doesn't open the door to weaken it in other areas. So at the very least, we must acknowledge that abstract values of agency cashed out in terms of consent might mean something a little bit different in practical contexts in certain areas. And if there's no meaningful consent, we must be prepared to say so, and maybe say that perhaps in this area, we're not talking about consent, we're talking about a related concept. So.
Thanks a lot, Paula, for bringing together a lot of views which I've heard already in the debate until now. And as a last speaker, I would like to invite Afra Kerr, Professor of Sociology and Mining Lead of Adapt Center, to give her take on the issue.
Thank you, Yo. Can you hear me okay?